All right, welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving straight into one of the absolute most consequential historical events of the 20th century. But, we aren't going to be looking at this from dusty war rooms or through the eyes of politicians giving grand speeches. What really fascinates me is the deeply personal, human side of Dunkirk. We're going to explore the exact experiences of the men on the ground and those everyday civilians out on the water to understand how an absolute catastrophe was turned into this truly profound story of survival.
So just consider this reality for a second. The sea was the only road home. Those words belong to Private Tommy Riley. Back in late May of 1940, Tommy was literally crouching in the sand holding a salt-crested rifle. He was just 22 years old, a Londoner. And honestly, incredibly, before this incredibly perilous week, he had never even seen the sea before. Literally never. And yet, looking out at the English Channel, that freezing, hammered pewter water was quite literally his only avenue for survival.
Now, think about this number, 400,000. That is the staggering number of men making up the British Expeditionary Force who were trapped. They had been relentlessly driven back across Belgium and northern France, basically squeezed into this ever-shrinking pocket around the coastal town of Dunkirk. I mean, we're talking about 400,000 human beings backed completely against the water, waiting for rescue ships that they were honestly terrified might never come. It just instantly sets up the unbelievably high stakes of this moment in history. Section 1. Trapped on the beach. Let's set the scene on May 29th, 1940.
The contrast between these two forces was just absolute. You had the German Blitzkrieg, this overwhelming, fully mechanized war machine packed with tanks, dive bombers, and these endless columns of gray infantry that had completely shattered the Allied lines. Then you have the trapped Allies. Tommy's company, for example, had just finished a grueling 30-mile march with basically no food and zero sleep. Their boots were literally falling apart on their feet. Many guys had even tossed their rifles just to lighten the load, though, Tommy actually kept his, feeling like it was the last honest thing he owned. Now they were reduced to just standing and waiting in chest-deep water, hoping for a rescue.
Just picture the visceral, terrifying sensory reality of this environment. The sky above them is literally burning with this intense orange glow from oil fires. The town right behind them has been reduced to nothing but a skeleton of brick and twisted iron. Ahead is that cold sea, and because the tide was out so incredibly far, the destroyers they desperately needed for rescue looked like little toy boats way out on the horizon. It's almost impossible to imagine, but men stood in perfectly orderly lines in freezing, chest-deep water for hours on end in an absolute literal hellscape.
Section 2. Death from above. Let's talk about the Stuka threat.
The main source of terror from the sky was the Stuka dive bomber. This was a German ground attack aircraft perfectly designed to drop from the sky like a hawk. But the thing that made it truly, deeply horrifying was the sound. A terrifying howling siren would scream right before it dropped its payload, sending huge geysers of exploding sand everywhere. Tommy's superior, Sergeant Mills, made a pretty grim observation about this psychological warfare. After spitting out sand from a nearby blast, he just plainly stated that the enemy was trying to completely break the men's spirit before the boats even had a chance to arrive.
So on May 29th, the waiting and the relentless bombardment kicked off. But as night finally fell, it actually brought this strange sort of mercy. See, the Luftwaffe hated flying in the dark. And in that moonlight, the discipline shown by these guys was incredible. Hundreds of men, still standing out there in the freezing sea, quietly sang, "They'll always be in England, together in the dark." Then, around 2 a.m., a naval officer with a megaphone makes this totally desperate call. Small craft, any man who can row, fall in. And this strange, improvised operation stretches all the way to dawn on June 1st, marking the final, limping voyages of an incredibly unexpected fleet.
Section 3. The little ships arrive. The start of a totally unprecedented civilian rescue.
What actually answered that desperate call was something nobody saw coming. They got boats like the Lady Grace. Now, this wasn't some armored warship. It was a brightly painted blue yacht with nice white trim. Basically a rich guy's weekend toy from Southampton. I mean, try to visualize that contrast for a second. A bright, cheerful little pleasure yacht rolling right up to an apocalyptic war zone under a sky completely full of fire towards a beach black with desperate, exhausted men.
And incredibly, standing right there at the wheel of this weekend toy was Captain Charles Hampton. He was a retired Royal Navy sailor, this older white-haired guy who literally just threw on his naval blazer and calmly steered his personal yacht right into hell. He's calling out to the soldiers, "Room for 30. No panic, lads. We'll make 2 trips if we have to." He just perfectly embodies the sheer, jaw-dropping bravery of these everyday civilian sailors who volunteered to ferry these men out to the larger destroyers, packing them in shoulder to shoulder.
Now, these rescue runs escalated in danger incredibly fast. On the very first trip, Captain Hampton had to frantically zigzag the Lady Grace just to dodge artillery shells screaming down from the dunes. By trip 3, they were evading active machine gun fire, stitching the water right next to them, while Tommy was literally pressing field dressings onto wounded men right there on the wooden deck. And by the final trip at dawn on June 1st, the yacht's hull had actually taken shrapnel, the engine temp gauge was completely pegged in the red, and the shore had descended into absolute total chaos. But you know what? That old captain brought her in one last time anyway.
Section 4. An unbreakable spirit saved.
By the time June 1st hit, that incredible British discipline was, understandably, finally breaking down. Exhausted, terrified men were just swimming desperately toward absolutely anything that floated. But even amidst all this breakdown, the humanity stayed intact. Soldiers like Tommy and Sergeant Mills were still literally stopping to drag severely wounded soldiers through the surf. They actually carried a young lieutenant who had lost both his legs onto the Lady Grace using a makeshift stretcher built out of just rifles and winter coats.
And right as the Lady Grace pulled away for that final time, they got this massive moment of triumph. A lone British Spitfire came roaring low right overhead, actively chasing down a German bomber. For these men on the deck, who'd been completely helpless targets for the Stukas for days on end, seeing this single plane finally return the sky to the Allies pulled these hoarse, desperate cheers right out of their exhausted throats. It was just a tiny, but incredibly vital moment of hope.
But as Tommy stood there at the rail watching France slip away into the distance, he knew the grim math of this whole miracle. Tens of thousands of men were successfully evacuated, yes, which is amazing, but thousands and thousands were tragically left behind. And we have to remember, the only reason anyone was escaping at all was because the French rearguard was holding that perimeter, fighting this utterly desperate delaying action just so the British forces could flee.
As the white cliffs of Dover finally started to appear through the mist, Tommy and Sergeant Mills were just sharing a cigarette in total silence. And then, Sergeant Mills asks this question that honestly goes to the very heart of the entire event. He looks over and says, "Reckon they'll call this a defeat, Tommy?"
Tommy just looked around at the crowded deck full of filthy, totally exhausted but fundamentally alive men. He looked out over the water at the hundreds of little civilian boats crisscrossing the channel like bees trying to save their hive, and he delivered this powerful, profound realization: "No, Sergeant, this is the day we didn't break." It brilliantly, perfectly illustrates how a massive military retreat can somehow, simultaneously, be a profound spiritual victory.
So why does all this matter? What's the real takeaway for us? Years later, Tommy Riley wouldn't be thinking about the politicians or the grand strategies of the generals. Because what really mattered at Dunkirk was the micro-level humanity. It was that small blue yacht with the white trim, the incredibly patient queues of men standing in freezing water, and an old retired sailor named Charles Hampton who firmly shook a young private's hand and who flat out refused to let his country fall alone.
You know, the war would go on to rage for 5 more terrible years. But on those specific beaches, an army, and honestly, more importantly, a spirit was saved. So I want to leave you with this final thought to really reflect on. When you are faced with absolute destruction and truly overwhelming odds, what actually defines a victory? Is it the literal ground you hold, or is it the spirit you absolutely refuse to let break? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope it sparked your curiosity to go out and learn even more about our shared history.